Okay, welcome back. I'm glad that you've all decided to join us for week two. So, just like in week one, I will be posting a number of videos that we can check out, and then hopefully those videos will spur some conversation, and we can have a back and forth. First, I'd like to thank the people that submitted questions. They don't all have to be in the form of questions. If you want to just make an observation, or you found something interesting, or you found something uninteresting, anything that you'd like to share about the material, I think would be valuable. So, first of all, thank you to those of you who submitted some questions. And I did my best to respond to you in the Canvas app. And if one question spurs another question, we can continue that as a thread, or as some of you did, feel free to start your own thread. So, I did want to just take a minute at the outset of week two and address some of the questions. If we were doing this in person, this is a conversation that we could have back and forth in class. When I do, it feels weird talking for 35, 40 minutes uninterrupted without having any interaction with the students. Sometimes when I go 10 minutes in class and I feel like I'm on a roll, and then somebody will put their hand up, and you look at them and say, and you're thinking to yourself, all right, this person is going to have a really probative, interesting question, and then invariably it's, can I go to the bathroom? Uh, that's soul sucking. So thank you guys that were brave and jumped on right away with the question. So thank you. And I wanted to address just a few of them. So Monica had a question about Saint-Chapelle in Paris, and specifically the stained glass at Saint-Chapelle. So I have not been to Saint-Chapelle. And I feel really embarrassed saying this. I've spent a lot of time in Paris, but those of you who have been to Paris, feel free to back me up here. You could spend years there and not see everything. So as big a fan as I am of Gothic architecture and late medieval architecture, I am ashamed to say that I haven't been to this building. So I stole this picture from the internet. This isn't one of my pictures, but a couple of things that I will point out just from the picture is you can see the vaulted ceiling, which is the architectural feature, which will do a lot to take the weight off of the walls themselves, so the walls can be thin enough to support those really beautiful stained glass features. Unfortunately, Monica, the windows or the stained glass that you see here in Saint Chapelle, which literally means Chapel of the Saints, isn't original. So we can do an approximation. There are a number of events in history that in European history, which unfortunately have taken away a lot of examples of art and antiquity. One of them is, well, natural disasters are one thing. Another one is war. When I showed you the cathedral at Reims, that cathedral was largely rebuilt. Another one is the Protestant Reformation. So when the Reformation breaks out in 1517 and is followed by the peasant uprising, a lot of these churches in Northern Europe, in the Holy Roman Empire, are torn down and destroyed, or a lot of the artwork inside are destroyed. When we think about the iconoclasm with which we associate the Byzantine Empire, so it's a very simplistic way to look at religion. If we're following the commandments, you want something that's plain and unadored. So in a lot of these places where the Protestant Reformation took hold, where Lutheranism and Calvinism took hold, they went around and they smashed icons and statues and stained glass. There's a remarkable cathedral in Germany where the followers of Luther went in and smashed all of the statues, but the the rear ends were very difficult to smash. So you go into the cathedral today, and it's just butts everywhere. So the Reformation would have been one thing. Now, in France, the Protestant Reformation does not really take hold. You have a small Protestant minority, the Huguenots, but these churches are allowed, and chapels and minor basilica are allowed to go without a great deal of destruction. So, but what does happen in France, unfortunately, for those of us who are lovers of art history and lovers of church art history, is the French Revolution. So in the 18th century, a lot of these places are destroyed. The French are, if nothing else, very pragmatic when it comes to art and beauty. So many of the holy places, like Notre Dame, are converted into temples of wisdom or temples to the Enlightenment. But a lot of this art and architecture is destroyed. And Sainte-Chapelle is one of the things that had to be almost completely rebuilt. So what you're looking at is a more modern reconstruction of what Sainte-Chapelle looked like. The stained glass, though, is beautiful. I agree with you. And when we look at Venice and the island of Murano in particular, we'll take a look at how some of this stuff is made. And I also think it's a pretty fun story when it comes to industrial espionage, if that's something that you're interested in too. So thank you, Monica. So this is Sainte-Chapelle. I promise the next time I get to Paris, I will make it a point to visit this, especially since you asked a question about it. Joanne had a really cool question, I thought, about the Oracle of Delphi and the Parthenon, and about how it touched Greek architecture. So the question was about the Oracle building, but I thought it was phrased in an interesting way. When we talk about the Oracle of Delphi, the Oracle was actually a person. So there's a picture of her, and we don't really know how the process went. We can guess. So the Oracle was in business because temples are a business, churches are a business. People would come from all over the Greek world and pay homage and give money to the Temple of Apollo, and the Oracle herself would go into a trance-like state, and then that whatever she said in that trance-like state would be interpreted by the priests, and then the priest would give whoever came to see the Oracle of Delphi their translation. I thought that this cartoon was pretty cool because you see this like smoke rising from beneath her. Modern archaeologists have done some excavation work at Delphi, and they think that there's a possibility that gas vents in the mountain produce this like natural gas, some kind of like with a hallucinogenic effect. So maybe she was having like drug-induced visions, which would have been pretty cool. So initially, the Oracle of Delphi was a teenage girl, a virgin. And for whatever reason, they had a hard time keeping the Oracle a virgin. So later in the Oracle's history, by the time we get to the 5th and 6th century, she had been replaced. The name of the Oracle is the Pythia, and the Pythia had been replaced by an elderly woman. So that's the story of the Oracle. And as I said in the response in the discussion thread, Joanne, the Oracle was always famous for delivering this kind of cryptic response that could be interpreted a number of different ways. The thing that they always said about the Oracle's response is, know yourself. If you really understand yourself, then you'll be better at the interpretation of her prophecy. So, for example, there's this famous example of a king who's thinking about invading a neighboring city-state, and he goes to the Oracle and says, well, what do you think? And the Oracle's response is, if you undertake this invasion, a great empire will be destroyed. And so he does that thinking that he's going to win this war, and it turns out that the empire that was destroyed was his own. Can be interpreted two ways. For those of us who love classical Greek history, the most famous prophecy of the Oracle of Delphi was the one delivered to the Athenians as the Persians under, I believe it was Darius the Great, is invading. And they go to the Oracle. How can we prevent this great invasion? And the Oracle says, the wooden walls alone will save you. And a group of Athenians take that literally, and they go to the top of the Acropolis and they build a wooden stockade fence. And another group of Athenians, led by Themistocles, interprets that as Athens can only survive if she evacuates her population and goes to the sea and builds a navy. So the former answer got all of those people who built the wooden stockade fence atop the Acropolis killed, and the Persians destroyed all of the buildings atop the Acropolis. They razed them to the ground. But eventually the Athenians are successful in the Persian War. It's Xerxes. It just occurred to me who the Persian emperor was. So it's the navy under the Athenians, the wooden walls that make Athens a great empire in their own right. And they're able to put together this thing called the Delian League. And those are the Athenians who eventually build the Acropolis the way that we see it now, with the Propylaea and the Erechtheum and the Parthenon. So really cool question from Joanne about the Oracle of Delphi, and then something specific about the Parthenon and the roof at the Parthenon. So thank you. One of the students in the class, I've actually gone back and forth with her, teasing her that she should be the one teaching this class. Deborah Carchidi, who has my job at Washington Township High School as the AP European History teacher, pointed out very correctly that the best example that we can look at for Greek architecture actually isn't in Greece. It's in Sicily. So what is a giant Greek temple doing in Sicily, I guess, is one of our questions. And that story actually informs the Renaissance. So I've never been to Sicily. So Deborah, if you're listening to this and you want to hop on the discussion thread and talk about your travels in Magna Graecia, please feel free. But this is the same style of temple that we saw, that we've seen, albeit a little bit smaller, at the Acropolis, just in one of the Greek cities in Sicily. So as the city-states of Greece get larger and more populated and wealthier, Greece begins planting colonies in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Western Mediterranean, as far north as the Black Sea. We call that Greater Greece, or Magna Graecia. Some of those colonies are in southern Italy, Rhegium, for example. Some of those colonies are in this very wealthy, very prosperous island off the coast of Italy, and that's Sicily. Those of you who are familiar with later Italian history, we know that the further south in Italy you go, and if you go to Sicily in the 19th, 20th, 21st century, it tends to be the poorest part of Italy. That was not true 2,500 years ago. For a while, Sicily was the breadbasket. Sicily and Egypt together produced enough grain to feed the classical world. Sicily was prime real estate, and generations of Greeks tried their best to conquer Sicily. The largest cities in ancient Sicily were Greek colonies, Syracuse being the largest one. So if you travel in southern Italy or Sicily, you may see temples that look like this. And how do we know if they're Greek, or how do we know if they are Roman copies of Greek temples? And the easiest way to answer that is try to figure out when they were constructed. So this is from the 5th century BC, so we know it is a Greek building. All sorts of colonies in southern Italy and in Sicily where people spoke Greek. They worshiped the Greek pantheon of gods, and they engaged in Greek culture, Greek sculpture, Greek architecture. Now, what does that have to do with the Renaissance? Well, in an earlier video, I made the argument that the Renaissance did in fact begin in Italy. And that begs a natural question. Why did the Renaissance begin in Italy? Well, when people like Petrarch are looking out their back window from places like Tuscany or in their travels to the southern part of their own peninsula, these are the buildings that they can see. And sometimes they're ruined, sometimes they're in better condition than others. But it's the classicism from that period which is one of the ways that we define the Renaissance, like a rebirth to the ancient world. So nobody in Flanders is looking out their bedroom window and is seeing buildings like this. You know, nobody in London and nobody in Paris can see quite the same examples of the ancient world in the same way that the Italians did. So there is a Greek building, many Greek buildings in Sicily. Last question that we got, another really interesting question was, hey, Rich, you are talking about France, you're talking about Italy quite a bit. Didn't really hear you say anything about Spain. And isn't Spain important to the Renaissance? And the answer to that question is, yeah, Spain is really important to the Renaissance. But there's a reason that we'll start first in Italy and then go to Spain rather than someplace else. So, as I said in the answer to Mike and Denise, when we talk about the Spanish, well, let me start by saying it's always been my belief that the Renaissance follows the money. So art and culture flower where people have the disposable income to pay for art and culture. So there's a reason why $100 million Hollywood blockbusters are made in Hollywood and not made in, pick another country. This also answers the question, why did the Renaissance begin in northern Italy and not southern Italy? Because by the time we get to the 13th and 14th century, northern Italy was so much wealthier than southern Italy. Tuscany is more wealthy than Calabria. Spain, like England, like Sweden, like France, in the late Middle Ages, is trying to play catch up with Italy. The city-states of Italy are on these crusader trade routes. They have a stranglehold over trade in the Mediterranean. They have a stranglehold over the great banking houses, with a few exceptions. They are dominant in the wool trade. So the city-states of northern Italy are the ones getting wealthy, and they're the ones that can pay for a Michelangelo ceiling or a Donatello sculpture or a brand new cathedral. Things are going to happen in the late 15th and early 16th century that are going to flip that world on its head. We see a shift in power and wealth from the Mediterranean world to what we call the Atlantic world. So because it's Spanish explorers and then later conquistadors that first explore and then conquer the New World, the Americas, and all of that gold is flowing from South America and Central America into Spain, then we see a flowering of the art and culture of Spain. We get a kind of Spanish Renaissance. So the painting that I have here in this picture, you've probably seen before. It's called Las Meninas by the most important painter of, well, maybe in the history of Spain, Diego Velázquez. He painted in a style that we will call Baroque. So We're going to take a look at Renaissance art and then look at the way that Renaissance art evolves into something called Mannerism. And if you folks are interested and you want to check out what makes this painting so interesting and unique, we can certainly spend some time talking about Baroque. It's your class. Just let me know where you want to go. So a little bit about Spain there. So I would say if we want to spend some time with Spanish Baroque, we'll talk about Velázquez and El Greco. And I think we can cut it short here. And then the next thing that we will talk about in my second video for the week will be the crisis of the 14th century.